This episode is brought to you by the Financial Times. When it comes to news, it's easy to find out what, who, where, and when. But why is harder. FT journalism goes deeper to help you see the whole story and understand the issues that matter. Why did it happen? Why is it important? Why will it matter?
Listeners to The Rest is History can save over 40% on an annual digital subscription to the Financial Times by visiting ft.com/history. For the why, Financial Times. This is an advertisement by BetterHelp. January arrives with a sense of expectation and change. But real change is rarely loud or dramatic.
It's noticing what no longer needs to be there. Thoughts you keep turning over even when they're not helping.
And when you live with those long enough, they can start to feel normal until you pause and see them more clearly. That's where perspective helps. Not fixing yourself, just creating space to understand what's been weighing you down.
Therapy can offer that space, a clearer view of your own patterns and what's worth holding on to. BetterHelp makes starting straightforward. You answer a few questions and they match you with a qualified therapist. If it doesn't feel right, you can switch at any time.
Whether you're into New Year's resolutions or not, working to better yourself is something everyone should do. And you don't even need to bulldoze your life to do it. Simply use BetterHelp.
BetterHelp makes it easy to get matched online with a qualified therapist. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/restishistory. That's betterhelp.com/restishistory.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Car shopping shouldn't feel like preparing for a marathon of paperwork. That's why Carvana makes buying and financing your car easy. From start to finish, search thousands of vehicles with great prices. All online, all on your time. And when you're ready, your new car shows up right at your door. It doesn't get better than that. Buy your car the easy way. On Carvana. Delivery fees may apply.
Hello, happy Easter. In the first half of the 1st century AD, there took place probably the single best known event in all human history. There are 4 main accounts, all written decades afterwards, and this is one of them. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him, and plaiting a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spat upon him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they'd mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. As they went out, they came upon a man of Cyrene, Simon by name. This man they compelled to carry his cross. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, the place of the skull, they offered him wine to drink mingled with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots. Then they sat down and kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." So, Tom Holland, that's a story with which we and a large proportion, probably almost all of our listeners, are extremely familiar. And there are all kinds of conversations we could have about the historicity of this, about whether Jesus really existed, about whether this really happened. But what we wanted to focus on today was the act of crucifixion itself. Because obviously, when we think of the crucifixion, we think of Jesus. But presumably at the time, Tom, I mean, you'll know far more about this than me, crucifying somebody would not have been unusual, would it, in the Roman world?
No, crucifixion was a very common form of execution. And it was a form of execution that was basically seen as the absolute worst that you could inflict. So as a governor of a province, if you were faced with rebellion, banditry, insurrection, you could inflict a range of punishments. So you could burn someone to death. You could put them to the beasts, so make them a public show in the arena, and people would would cheer as they watched them devoured by wild animals, or you could crucify them. And crucifixion was seen as the worst of these fates because it was protracted and humiliating, even more humiliating than being burnt to death or devoured by lions. And it was that idea of being made a public spectacle that I think reflects the way in which, for the Romans, to be shamed was almost as terrible as to be tortured. And that's why, as well as being the paradigmatic fate that was visited on rebels, it was also the paradigmatic fate that was visited on slaves. So
when Jesus, I mean, we'll come back to Jesus' crucifixion, but he's been crucified as a sign of humiliation, as a sign that he is no more than a slave, and that's why the King of the Jews stuff is bitterly ironic, I suppose.
Absolutely. So it was. Crucifixion is called supplicium servile by a Roman writer called Valerius Maximus, the punishment of slaves. Josephus, the Jewish writer who records the war that destroys Jerusalem, he calls it the most wretched of deaths. Even a grammarian called Varro, he writes about the crux, the cross, and he says that the word of it is harsh on the ears. So everything about it is cruel, savage, bitter, and that generates a kind of paradox, which is that although, as you say, it's incredibly common, and it's something that serves the Roman world as an emblem of Rome's power. It's a statement about Rome's authority, about its right to inflict brutal torture on those who oppose them. It's also something that the Romans themselves seem to have been a bit embarrassed about. They didn't like to draw attention to it. Crucifixions don't happen in the center of town. So in the account you read, Golgotha, which is otherwise unattested, is a place presumably outside the city limits. And in Rome itself, crucifixions took place on a remote area of the Esquiline Hill, that only very gradually, as Rome expands, gets kind of developed. But for a long time, it has this kind of taint. And that carrion taint, which hangs over crucifixion, means that the Romans themselves are actually very reluctant to acknowledge that it's a Roman practice. So they say, yes, we do it, but this is a practice that has its origins among barbarians. So it's
that's interesting.
Yeah.
So let's get back to the root of it. So when, Tom, do we get our first references to crucifixions? It predates the empire, presumably? It
does. It's complicated, though, because we think of crucifixion as a kind of set practice, that there are set rules and so on. It's hard to know whether that's the case. The only accounts we have of an actual crucifixion by the Romans are the 4 gospel accounts, which in itself is telling, I think. The Romans are reluctant to go into all the gory details. And if we go back before the Romans, there are various accounts, chiefly by Greek writers, of penalties that seem to involve suspending someone, hanging them, putting them up in a public place and suspending them from a tree or a piece of wood. And so this fate could be crucifixion as we understand it, in the sense that Christians would understand it today, but it could also be impalement or something like that.
So I have a question, Tom. Friend of the show, Alexander the Great, is said to have crucified large numbers of people after capturing the city of Tyre, because he was cross. They wouldn't let him in to worship a statue of Heracles. So that, now, is that because of course the accounts of Alexander that we have are written later. So is that putting back a sort of Roman practice and thinking that he must have done it? Or is it plausible that Alexander was crucifying people and that was a common practice in the 4th century BC?
I think it's likelier to be an actual reflection of what he did, because Alexander is invading the Persian Empire and he is taking on the role of a Persian king. And crucifixion, or at least suspending people, impaling people, hanging them from, in public so that they suffer and die in public, is seen as something that originates with the Persians.
So Ali Ansari, who's been a guest on the show many times and says everything began with the Persians, will be delighted to hear that crucifixion is top tortures are among them.
But the Persians are famous for the sophistication and subtlety of their torture. And much, much later, the Marquis de Sade, who is a guy who really knows what he's talking about when it comes to torture, says that the Persians, of all the peoples who have ever lived, were the greatest at torturing people to death. And the idea that you punish rebels by exposing them to humiliation, the humiliating gaze, is something that certainly goes back to Darius the Great, who is ruling. He's the king who sends the expedition that gets defeated at the Battle of Marathon, the expedition to destroy Athens. And he comes to power amid a coup, and all kinds of Persian provinces, cities rebel against him, and among them is Babylon. And Darius takes 3,000 Babylonians and he crucifies them, which could, as I say, mean, he impales them. But certainly this is remembered. This is a kind of kingly thing to do. This is what the great king does. So I imagine that Alexander, that there is an echo of that behavior. Yeah.
So a slightly pedantic question. You said he crucifies them, which may mean that he impales them. So that implies to me that the original word that is being used, is not the word crucify, right? That it's some other translation or some other word that could mean crucifixion but could mean something else. Is that right? That there's some sort of vague intermediate term.
Well, a stavros. That's where the Greek name comes from.
That's where the word stavros comes from.
Exactly. Is a cross. It's conventionally translated as a cross, but it could be a pole. It could be. It's hard because crucifixion becomes so famous, and because the role it plays in Christianity is so key. It kind of, we tend to back project that what happens there onto the early use of it by Greek writers. We can't know for sure. It could be a kind of range of things. But the key thing is that you are exposed to public obloquy, and that is absolutely the fundamental aspect of it, and it's what makes the crucifixion, with a capital C, so extraordinary and strange that this should be the foundational image. Because obviously for Christians, the key to Easter is the resurrection. It's the rising from the dead. That's the whole essence of the story. But that, in terms of antiquity, is not so unusual. Lots of mortals are raised up to the heavens. In the lifetime of Jesus, Augustus Caesar has been raised up to the heavens. Augustus Caesar's adoptive father, Julius Caesar, has been raised to the heavens. There are all kinds of gods who die and then get raised from the dead.
Yeah. And obviously ancient Egyptian religion is full of this, isn't it?
Yes.
Is this what happens to Osiris or Horus or somebody?
Yeah. So Osiris gets killed, loses his penis, which is obviously something that doesn't happen to Jesus. And then he gets resurrected to rule as king of the dead.
Yeah.
So this is all very common.
But it's the humiliation that is unusual. Right?
That is the strangeness. That is the weirdness. And until you properly understand its significance in the Roman imagination and in the Greek imagination and indeed in the Jewish imagination, you don't properly understand how strange the whole thing is.
Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the Romans and crucifixion. So do we have any sense, Tom, of the kind of people and the kind of crimes for which you would be crucified?
Yeah, so as I said, it's chiefly visited on rebels against Roman rule in the provinces and on slaves. And it comes to serve as, therefore, a kind of warning to anyone, be they a slave rebelling against the master or a provincial rebelling against the power of Caesar, of what your fate will be. And one of the weirdest expressions of this is in the writings of Pliny the Elder,
You love a bit of Pliny.
I love a bit of Pliny. For the new book I'm doing, I've been reading through all his natural history, which is this incredible kind of compendium of all kinds of sometimes very, very accurate facts and sometimes not entirely accurate. And he covers, natural phenomena and
It's like this podcast, Tom.
Well, no, you're very against natural phenomena, aren't you? So he loves his birds, for instance, which you're very hostile.
We were already
to.
talking before recording this about whether we should do a podcast on the history of birds.
Well, we're doing one with pigeons, of course. I
reacted with incredulity, but
well, plenty
ornithological fans will be horrified to hear this.
So, but among them, he talks about animals, and he talks about the lion as the king of the lions, and he has this extraordinary story about how. Polybius, who is a Greek who accompanied Scipio Aemilianus, who destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, that he was with Scipio in Africa, and he saw Scipio crucify lions so that the other lions, Pliny writes, would be deterred from attacking the cities of Africa by fear of suffering the same fate.
That seems absolutely horrible and bizarre.
Isn't it? Isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, is
it plausible that he did that?
Well, it's in Pliny, so.
and also, Tom, would it act as a deterrent to other lions?
I think it's unlikely, but obviously, what it would do would act as a deterrent to people in Africa. Because I'm more
shocked by that than I am by the crucifixion of thousands of people that we've talked about earlier in the podcast.
Well, there's another crucifixion of animals story, which is the famous account of the Gauls who capture Rome, seize Rome, and they occupy the city, but the Capitol holds out, and the Gauls are creeping up the side of the rock to try and storm the top, and the watchdogs don't bark, but the sacred geese of Juno, the queen of the gods, hiss and alert the guards. And so every year, that on the anniversary of that day, the geese are put in a litter and carried in triumph through the city, but the watchdogs are crucified. I mean, it's
through subsequent generations of dogs.
Yeah.
I mean, that makes Jeremy Thorpe look positively.
No, well, we haven't had dogs being killed for a while, so we're, as it were, terrible. Resurrecting the tradition.
Very good. That's a terrible story. Now, the reason I asked about who was crucified and why was because, and when you answered that, both of the examples you gave were about rebels. So you're not crucified by and large for a common or garden crime, even a murder. It's rebellion against. It's a crime against the state, against a threat to the integrity of the state. Is it that is punishable by
and the natural order?
Right.
So you do, if you're a slave and you kill your master, then not only are you crucified, but everyone in the household is crucified.
That again is ridiculously harsh.
Well, so this happens. I think trying to remember. Tacitus writes about it. I think it's in the reign of Nero that a senator is murdered by one of his slaves, and there's something like he has 500, 600 slaves, something like that, with women and children. And actually, even the Romans are appalled at the prospect of all these slaves who are entirely innocent being killed. And there is a kind of brief campaign to say, well, do we really need to do this? But they decide, yeah, we do. So the whole lot get crucified.
Wow, that is. I was about to say that's tough love, but there's no love in it.
No, there's no love in that at all.
It's just tough.
No, it's just tough. Yeah.
What about obviously the most famous crucified slave? Certainly in the modern Western imagination, is Spartacus. Mm-hmm. Was Spartacus crucified?
Well, he's supposed to have been killed in the final battle. Obviously, if you go along with the Kirk Douglas film, then he isn't, because everyone turns out to be Spartacus, and so they all get crucified. But the point of that, of course, is that the context for this is that Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean has generated an incredible amount of enslavement. Huge numbers of people have been enslaved. And among them, of course, are barbarians who are seen by Greeks as well as by Romans to be fitted for servitude. And therefore, Greeks and Romans tend not to worry about that particularly. But also among the people enslaved are Greeks who do not see themselves as a fit people to be enslaved. And so they are brought to Italy and to Sicily. And it's not like they are objecting to slavery as an institution. They're objecting to the fact that they are the slaves. That's the problem. And so through the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, you have large numbers of slave insurrections. and they get dealt with incredibly brutally, because maybe a quarter, maybe a third of the population of Italy by this point are slaves. So the Romans are sitting on the edge of a volcano.
So this is very analogous to the situation in 19th century American South.
Yes,
where you've got people, you've got a large slave population. People live in a constant state of they're either brutalized and terrorized on the one hand, or they're the owners who live in fear of insurrection.
Yes.
On the other, and are therefore driven to extremes.
Yes, and so therefore it becomes incredibly important that every slave absolutely understand what will happen if they in any way try and fight back. And so when Spartacus's rebellion is finished, famously, those who survive are crucified along the entire length of the Appian Way, which is across Italy to the heel of Italy. And these are serving as kind of billboards advertising Rome's power. That's what they're there for. And it's meant to be a kind of disgusting spectacle.
Yeah, which it must have been. I mean, so let's talk a tiny bit about the mechanics of crucifixion. Do we know much about that? Or our sole accounts? You said earlier on, if I heard you correctly, that our sole accounts really are the gospel accounts. So when historians write about crucifixion now, are they actually basing it on the Bible?
It's very, very difficult to escape it. There is physical evidence for it. So the earliest physical evidence was found in 1968, and it was in a tomb outside Jerusalem. It wasn't Jesus, for anyone who wonders about that. It was someone a bit later. And what that shows is, so it's the heel bone, and there's a nail driven through it, and it's still attached to the wood. And what that shows is, so if you imagine, how the crucifixion is portrayed in Christian art, the feet are crossed and a nail is kind of driven through the feet or maybe through the ankles.
Through both your ankles at once.
Yeah, but what this shows is that the side of the cross, the feet are put on either side of the cross, and then they're driven through the ankle. Again, I mean, that of course would enhance the humiliation of the experience, because you wouldn't be wearing a loincloth. So your legs would be spread. You'd be naked. Yeah, you'd be naked. And corroboration for that was actually found just before Christmas in Britain. So,
yes, you sent me the story. The story yeah, you sent it from The Guardian, because I know you're a massive admirer of The Guardian. And they found. So tell us about what they found.
Yes, so a whole kind of cemetery was excavated, and the bones were removed, and then it was only, I think, last year that they washed the mud off, and they discovered the same thing had happened, that there was a nail embedded in the through the ankle, and this was clearly this unfortunate had suffered crucifixion. However, I mean, again, there's no firm or fast rule on this, because it's perfectly possible that people were suspended by ropes. And in fact, Seneca, in an account, he says that part of the fun of it for the executioners is to kind of spice it up, to vary it. So he says that one victim may be suspended upside down with his head facing the ground. Others, in the classical sense, the image of Jesus with the arms spread along a yoke. Others, he says, I mean, horribly, and so this is where the confusion between crucifixion and impalement comes in, that people might drive a stake up through the genitals. So it's the variation of this seems to be important. So there's an account that Josephus writes about as the Romans are besieging Jerusalem, and they're trying to intimidate the defenders, and all the deserters, all the people who are kind of trying to slip out, who are armed, who are captured, they're crucified in front of the walls of the defenders to try and intimidate them. And Josephus describes how the soldiers, out of their hostility to the defending Jews, out of their hatred to them, that they kind of mix and match, that they will twist their victims into kind of strange positions, that basically that it's a bit of a laugh. And so in the account from the gospel that you read, where they mock Jesus, that seems entirely true to the evidence that we have for how the military the security apparatus dealt with their victims. That in a sense, making the victim look ridiculous and grotesque and foolish was a crucial part of the punishment. The more amusing you could make it, the kind of more credit you get with your colleagues.
Now, Tom, you haven't really answered my question about, in fact, you've utterly failed to answer the question.
What was the question?
The question was about how crucifixions worked in practice. So what do we actually know? Do you carry?
Okay.
So let's, in that biblical account, a man carries a cross. There's a big crowd, presumably. There's all the stuff with later on with sponges. There's a whole sort of there's a whole load of goings on. What do we actually know about what a crucifixion, an ordinary crucifixion, was like?
Well, to reiterate, there is no standard procedure. But having said that, discounting the gospel accounts, the evidence is that before you were crucified, you were very likely to be whipped, and the whip would be probably one with, so it'd be like kind of cat o' nine tails with chunks of metal on the tip. So it would
scourge you.
Yeah, it would gouge out chunks of your flesh. So it would be unspeakably painful. So that then you would be paraded through the streets. You would have to carry your, maybe not the bulk of the cross, but what was called the cross beam. And you would carry what was called a titulus, which was the description of your crime around your neck, so that people could read why it was that you were being crucified.
Tom, it's very Christian of you to be. It's interesting how you imagine yourself to be the crucified. I was thinking you would tell it from the crucifier's perspective.
Yes, I know. I'm portraying 2,000 years of Christian weathering there.
You are.
Yeah. I think the experience of crucifixion is obviously more vivid for the crucified than for the crucifier. I think
for the crucifier, it's just another working day.
It's just and it is another working day. So that's another kind of fascinating aspect of it, is that we have an account of they're kind of like an agency. They're like a kind of torture agency. That if you're a city council or something and you've got to, do your crucifixion.
God, they outsource it.
They outsource it. And there's a kind of advert from, saying all your crucifixion needs. We'll torture, we'll do the torturing, we'll burn them if you want. We'll gouge out the eyes if you like. That's fine.
Do you have a selection of packages you can sign up?
Exactly. So we have that. And so that's how we know that, there is a kind, as you say, there are kind of various packages that you can have. So you could have them whipped, you can have them maybe blinded, you can have them maimed beforehand. And, these are all options. Now, if you don't blind the victim before he goes up on the cross, then the likelihood is that fairly soon birds will come and peck out the eyes.
Oh, come on.
Because there's nothing you can do to stop them. And probably your genitals as well. They'll cluster around your genitals and your eyes and attack them. And we actually have documentary evidence for this from the Talmud, which in a commentary on the book of Genesis, and this is the account of that fans of Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat will remember. I think is it the butler? No, it's the baker. It's the baker ends up crucified. He dreams that he's on a tree. He's hanging from a tree. And this is interpreted as presaging his crucifixion. And in the commentary on it, in the Talmud, it says that birds will eat the flesh from your head, which is presumably the eyes, because that's the kind of the softest material. So, I mean, it's a horrible, horrible detail. And Josephus also describes how birds flock around.
Just before you get on with your torture porn, Tom, you said for the person being put on the cross. Are they always men?
I think almost invariably. So the slaves in the house that I mentioned in the reign of Nero, the women would have been executed as well. But it does seem to have been a distinctively suffered by men. How long are you up on the cross? That entirely depends. You could be there for days, and in a way, so I'm not a doctor, so I'm not entirely sure of the mechanics of it, but it is said that part of the torture is that you constantly have to lift yourself up because otherwise you'll suffocate. for reasons that I'm not entirely clear and that I gather are contested by medical people. But if that's the case, then, you're in a constant kind of seesawing motion. You've got your birds are pecking out your eyes, your body is kind of gouged out with this awful whip. People are gawping at you, your genitals are on display, and you're heaving yourself up and down. So, I mean, it's a repellent, horrible fate. And so that's why often people will break the leg as an act of mercy, because then you will suffocate and die and your agony will be over. And then when your agony is over, you'll be taken down from the cross. And the likelihood is that you will not be buried in a tomb. So the guy who was found outside Jerusalem was unusual. Jesus is unusual in this sense. The likelihood is that you will be carted away and chucked into a common tomb, and that is part of the punishment. So in Italy, if you have the deluxe torture package, you will have people who are dressed up in red, carrying bells, who will drag the bodies to the carrion tip, ringing bells as they go.
And does anybody survive?
Well, that's a good question. So Josephus, again, who is, by this point, although he's a Jew, he's kind of a pal with Titus, who is the Roman general who is commanding the war against the Jews. He asks Titus for a favor if some of his friends can be taken down from the crosses, and Titus says fine, and they get taken down and they still die, and they haven't been up for very long. So from the evidence of that, the likelihood is that even a few hours are going to be so excruciating and agonizing that you're going to die of it.
Yeah.
So just to reiterate, this is the most horrible of deaths, and it's the most humiliating of deaths. That's its significance in the Christian story. I think, culturally, it's far more significant than the fact that Jesus rises, that his believers believe him, he rises from the dead, is the fact that he has first suffered this horrific death.
And that's what makes him out as unique at that point in the kind of the pantheon of Near Eastern Mediterranean gods. I
think not just then, I think now. I mean, I think it is absolutely exceptional, and it explains so much that has made Christianity so culturally distinctive.
Okay, well, Tom, we'll take a break to allow the listeners to have a stiff drink, which they'll probably need after all that, because after all that gore and gruesomeness, we're going to get stuck into the greatest story ever told, the crucifixion of Jesus specifically, and then what happened to the practice of crucifixion after that, and of course, arguably the most resonant symbol in all human history, the cross. So we'll see you for all that after the break.
This episode is brought to you by the Financial Times. I think we both agree, Dominic, that in the clamour of countless voices competing to break the news and telling you the what, the who, and the where on these stories, there's often something missing, isn't there?
There is, Tom, because I think to get a true understanding of any story, you really need to know why. Take FT journalism. It goes deeper, providing the insight, analysis, and perspective to help you see the whole story and truly understand the issues that matter. Why did it happen? Why is it important? And why will it matter? I've got a brilliant example. So they had an article recently, a fascinating article about why populism became popular. And this Financial Times article absolutely delved into that. It was so interesting.
And does it nail it?
Yeah, it nailed it. Absolutely nailed it. And it really made me look at populism in a new light.
Well, if you're interested in the why, we have good news.
Yes, listeners to The Rest is History can save more than 40% on an annual digital subscription to the Financial Times by visiting ft.com/history. For the why, Financial Times.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
I mean, my finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory. Welcome back to The Rest is History. In the run-up to Easter, we're talking about crucifixion, and we've talked about the practice of crucifixion and the emphasis on humiliation and the sheer horror of the experience of being crucified. And Tom, I started this podcast with an account from the Gospel of, according to St. Matthew, almost certainly according to biblical scholars, I think, not written by St. Matthew, the crucifixion of Jesus. So there are a lot of elements that are in all four Gospels. It's an extraordinary thing that we have this event from the 1st century AD, a sort of fly-bitten part of the Roman Empire, 4 different sources, and of course there are others. There are other kind of apocryphal gospels and stuff, aren't there? So we have this. How true do you think these accounts are, or can we not talk about that in any meaningful way, about the veracity or accuracy of these accounts of Jesus' crucifixion?
Well, so there is a kind of there is a movement in biblical criticism called mythicism, which implies that the whole Jesus never existed. The whole thing is just a kind of riff on, vegetation gods live, die, come back to life, all that kind of stuff.
Jesus is Osiris or whatever.
Yes, or Adonis or that kind of thing. I think that is mad. I think that is the kind of atheist equivalent of creationism. It's putting the cart of what you want to believe in front of the horse of the evidence. And the evidence, I think, for the fact that Jesus was crucified is pretty strong. Okay. And I will cite a scholar, Geza Vermes, who is generally quite skeptical about the Gospels as historical evidence. But he says that the death of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross is an established fact, arguably the only established fact about him. So that's the measure of how skeptical he is. And as he points out, it's attested in the 4 Gospels, very detailed accounts. It's attested in the Acts of the Apostles. It's attested in the letters of Paul. It's attested outside the New Testament, almost certainly by Josephus, although we won't get into, we'll save that for the historical Jesus episode, whether Josephus does actually write about Jesus. I think he does, but it's a kind of complicated issue. Tacitus mentions it. It's alluded to in the Talmud. So I think it is very, very well attested. And I think more importantly than that, it's just not the kind of thing that anyone would have had any interest in making up.
Yes, because it's not a recommendation for your God, is it? If you're going to invent a God.
It's absolutely not. And I think the evidence for so we've talked about the Gospels, the 4 Gospels, but actually the really key evidence, if we're looking for, what about the crucifixion narratives might be historical, is actually the earliest texts written by a Christian, which are the letters of Paul.
Yeah. And
when you read Paul's letters, what becomes immediately vivid is that for Paul, the fact that Jesus suffered death on a cross is an enormous embarrassment, and that the embarrassment for Paul is entirely the point. That he's obviously kind of wrestled with the strangeness of it and the weirdness of it, and in a sense has kind of made it the basis for his entire explanation for who Jesus was and what happened. So I think that is absolutely fun. If you want, it's biblical criticism. It's the same as with all history. You look for the closest source, and in that sense, Paul's letters are really, really important
because they're written within a couple of decades of the
yes. But also interestingly, people say, well, he doesn't really talk about the passion. Wouldn't he talk about it? Well, no, because he's writing to people whom it's evident already know the story.
Yeah.
So this is it's clear that this is quite this is a story that people know about, that Christians know about, and I suspect that non-Christians know about as well, because clearly there was considerable public interest in Jesus's fate. He for someone who claims to be king of the Jews to be crucified by the Romans outside Jerusalem, in what's a very prominent place in Jewish life, it would have been noticed. It's not the kind of thing that I think. So, and if you look at Paul's letters and you try and kind of extrapolate from that, what can we work out from Paul's letters about the Passion? I think that you can see that he was crucified, that he was condemned by the Romans, that he had nails driven through his body, that he was buried. And those, I think, kind of sustain the basic historicity of the gospel accounts. Now, the more I've looked at it, the more I've thought about it, the more I've reflected on it, the more I've come to think that in its essentials, the gospel accounts are accurate. And one of the ways to sift that is that you look at the narratives, and if there are elements within it that seem to be the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, so in other words, to echo prophecies that have been made in what Christians call the Old Testament, Jews call the Tanakh, doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong, because obviously, you can cast things in biblical terms, absolutely historical things that have happened in biblical terms. It doesn't mean that they're ahistorical, but it perhaps means that they're less likely. So a kind of classic example of that is the account in the Gospels that at noon, the sky goes dark. That's, first of all, meteorologically improbable.
Right.
And secondly, it seems to echo a verse in the book of Amos. On that day, says the Lord God, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight. So,
and also, Tom, doesn't it seem like the kind of element that you put into, I don't want to sound like a kind of Hollywood filmmaker, but a sort of semi-apocalyptic moment, you make the sky go dark because that's kind of what the audience expects, and it's the kind of grand statement of divine significance.
Yes, exactly. That, and that, of course, is the moment when friend of the show, John Wayne, as the Roman centurion in The Great Story Ever Told, the great story.
Gosh. Are you going to treat us
like, truly this man was the Son of God? And Cecil B. DeMille, the director, says to him, could you put in a bit more awe, John, into your pronunciation of that? And so he says, "Oh, truly this man was the Son of God." Great story. Wow. Anyway, I didn't
think we were getting John Wayne in this podcast, but it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure. So on that basis, one way perhaps of sifting the stories is to look at stuff that doesn't have, biblical foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Of which I think that there are certain obvious aspects. So one we've already mentioned, which is the torture and the mockery before the crucifixion. That absolutely seems to go with the grain of Roman practice. And it should be added that when I say that Roman soldiers are doing it, these aren't actually probably Romans. They're probably not legionaries. They're probably recruited from Samaria, meaning that these soldiers are Samaritans. So, and people will know from the parable of the Good Samaritan, the whole point of that story is that Jews and Samaritans kind of hate each other. And so that's a kind of a shading to the story that often isn't drawn out.
Tom, can I just interject before you get back into the list of elements? For those people who don't know, what has Jesus been crucified for?
Okay, so this is another thing that I think is probably true. So that the titular, and that has the thing that Jesus is the King of the Jews, written in the three languages, so Hebrew and Greek and Latin. That, again, corresponds with what we know about Roman crucifixion practice, and the likelihood is that is why he was being crucified. He's been crucified. Yes, he. The Romans think that he's a royal pretender, and that's exactly the kind of thing that Romans crucify people for. Because to be a royal pretender, of course, is to dispute the authority of Caesar.
But then one other question on this, Tom, on the motive for the Romans crucifying him. a lot of people who are familiar with the story will know that Pontius Pilate famously doesn't really want to do it.
Washes his hands.
And then washes his hands of it and says, hence the phrase, and says, okay, fine, you want him dead, get on with it, it's nothing to do with me. I mean, to have that attitude and then to prescribe the ultimate punishment, the most hideous form of suffering, there seems to be a slight disjuncture between those two things. So Pontius Pilate doesn't really think Jesus is that bad a man, but says, okay, submit him to the worst torture imaginable. And that's quite a big leap.
Yeah, and people have said, I think correctly, that this is an attempt to spin it for a Roman audience.
Oh, right. So in other words, the Gospels are being written to try and convert Romans, and if the Romans are out and out baddies, it won't work. So Pontius Pilate has to be shown to be slightly...
Well, yeah, because the Gospels are probably being written in the wake of the Judean revolt, the Jewish revolt, maybe a bit before, a bit after, much debated, but around that time. And so Jews in rebellion against Caesar is not a good look. So this is something that has to be kind of spun quite carefully. Although having said that, the evidence of Pilate's term of office is that he does work hand in glove with the authorities in Jerusalem, who would effectively are the priests. So that idea of a kind of liaison between the priests and Pilate is not impossible. But the idea of Pilate, who seems to have been very robust in his approach to rebels, washing his hands and all that kind of stuff, that really does seem to be, I think, a kind of slight whitewashing.
Right.
But again, having so other things I think that are likely to be true, because why wouldn't they be? Simon of Cyrene, who you mentioned, helping Jesus with the cross, that seems to be true, not least because in Mark, he says that Simon of Cyrene's sons are well known to the Christian community. So he's unlikely to be saying that, if the whole story is just completely made up.
Right.
So
why would they get? Are we to believe that Simon of Cyrene is an adherent of Jesus?
That seems to be the implication.
Right.
That seems to be the implication. Yeah.
And all the stuff with the robes, the scarlet robe, the crown of thorns, all of that is part of the humiliation process.
Yeah. So that seems entirely possible.
Yeah.
The fact that he gets crucified at a place called Golgotha, which, as I said, it's the only reference to it that we have. That seems a very specific reference.
Kind of the execution ground outside the city.
Yeah, the place of the skull, supposedly. Women at the feet of the cross, perhaps. I mean, again, it's kind of detail that, why would someone make it up?
That would be plausibly a bit like the sort of getting the front seats at a hanging at Tyburn or the tricoteurs at the guillotine. Is it in?
Well, no, because they're not there to enjoy it. This is Mary and Mary Magdalene, and they're mourning it.
But it's plausible, isn't it, that there must have been people there who were there to enjoy it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the whole point of it.
You would imagine that public executions drew crowds.
Yes, absolutely.
And that there would be real kind of, and not quite, groupies is not the right word, but the real enthusiasts of public suffering.
Crucifixion fans. Well, and the gospel says much. They say that people stand there and jeer and mock him and say, well, if you're the Son of God, come down from the cross.
Yes.
That mockery is a part of the narrative. I think the story of Joseph of Arimathea, again, where does this come from if not from...
So he's the guy who takes him down.
So it's his tomb that Jesus' body is laid in.
Yeah, and he's another adherent, presumably.
Yes. The key aspect of this that does seem to be authentic is, and aside from the brute fact of the crucifixion, the fact that he was crucified on the order of the Romans, I think this is the third kind of key factor which massively influences the subsequent way that it's understood. He seems to have gone willingly to death. He does not fight against it. He seems to have surrendered to his fate in a way that impressed his followers and demanded to be understood and explained. And it's that kind of passive acceptance, the fact that he goes to his death like a lamb going to the sacrifice, that again massively influences the subsequent evolution of Christian history and theology.
Yeah, of course. But you think that adds to the veracity? Because you think if you made up the story, you'd have them fighting back or something?
I don't think it adds to the veracity, but I think it's likely to be a true detail. Okay. Because every Paul mentions it the Gospels mention it. It seems to have been fundamental to how Christians understood Jesus and his fate right from the very beginning.
And then Tom, okay, so I mean, I completely accept your argument that it really happened. I don't know, I'm not enormously well informed about this, but it seems implausible to me that you've got 4 different accounts that have completely invented. I mean, there's actually no real example I can think of.
No.
In history from this period of sources being completely wildly invented. I mean, I know we've had Ptolemy and his talking snakes previously in the podcast, but that was one detail in an otherwise true story.
Yeah, and I think that because this is in the Bible, and because for some people it's Holy Writ, infallible, and for other people it's evidence of kind of mumbo jumbo and superstition, and therefore has to be disproved. These are passages that are far more contested than any other, parallel pieces of writing from ancient history. But essentially, there's no difference.
Yeah,
as you know, you can read a passage that describes someone existed. A god appearing to him. We did the Rubicon. Caesar standing on the banks of the Rubicon. We know that this is attested by people who saw it, and yet you get in the accounts of kind of mysterious figures playing the pipes and all that kind of stuff. So it's no different with this. The fact that there are supernatural elements within it doesn't discount the fact that other elements of the accounts are likely to be true.
Agreed. Because of course, if we were to cast out all sources with supernatural elements, there'd be nothing left from before the 17th century or something.
Absolutely. And also in the context of antiquity, to have sources that reference this event within 20 years of it happening, so Paul's letters, and detailed narrative accounts, so the Gospels, that's let's say 40 to 60 years after the events, by the standards of ancient history, these are really good. We talked about this in the context of Alexander the Great,
I was about to say or
Muhammad. These. Yeah. If you cut, I came to the gospel accounts from studying the sources for the life of Muhammad, and I couldn't believe how close in time they were.
Yeah. So Tom, let's just start to move. We don't want to exhaust our listeners' patience completely, so let's move through the subsequent history. At what point would you say does the act of crucifixion become indelibly associated with Jesus? So in other words, in AD 100, when people think about crucifixion in the Roman world, they probably don't think of Jesus.
No.
So what point does that change?
So even in the 2nd century, Christian apologists are saying, this is really embarrassing. They find it awkward. And I think it's very telling that although Christians do write about it, they don't seem to have illustrated it. And the people who do illustrate it are either mocking them. So there's a famous piece of graffiti from Rome, which it shows a donkey, a man with a donkey's head being crucified. And the wording is Alexamenos worships his god, which is obviously a kind of a mockery of Christians. And magicians start to use it in their spells. They start to illustrate crosses, trying to invoke the Christian god. By the 4th century, of course, the cross absolutely comes to be associated with the figure of Jesus, not least because
it appears to Constantine.
Because it appears to Constantine.
Yeah. So is that the point at which the cross stopped? So with Constantine, and then I suppose, I don't know, Theodosius the Great or something, is that the point at which the cross becomes, because it starts to connote something very different, doesn't it? There's a point at which the cross becomes a symbol of power and a symbol of the state, rather than a symbol of being a loser.
It's always been a symbol of power and of the state. That's what it is for the Romans.
Good point.
The paradox of the cross is that it effectively completely reverses that narrative, because it's saying, Jesus has triumphed over those who've killed him. The slave has triumphed over the master. The torture person has triumphed over the torturers. That's the kind of paradox of it. And although you're right that, of course, when, with this sign conquer, that's what Constantine sees in his dream. And the cross becomes an emblem of power for the Roman emperor. The fact that it was an emblem of torture, that's not something that they can get rid of. And they still, they're still struggling with it right the way through into the 5th century. So in the British Museum, there's an ivory that shows Jesus on the cross. And this is the first time that the crucifixion has been portrayed. by a Christian artist, so far as
Ever.
we know.
Wow, amazing.
And Jesus on that cross is shown basically, he like a kind of competitor from Love Island. He's buff and honed, and essentially what he's an athlete who has won.
Yeah.
He's won, in the Olympics. That's what he is. And his face is absolutely serene. And that's the tradition that then passes into Byzantine art and Orthodoxy. The idea that Christ on the cross is serene in victory. He's a victor. But in the West, that tradition becomes different. And by the turn of the millennium, you're starting to get sculptures of Jesus being shown dead on the cross. And then over the course of the Middle Ages, increasingly, he's shown as suffering the degree of torture and agony that he would have done. And that becomes fundamental to the way that Latin Christians understand Jesus and his suffering, and the passion. So, his suffering becomes kind of fundamental to medieval Christian religious practice.
But in the East, it's the image of Christ triumphant, isn't it? Christ, the sort of image, they don't seem to revel in the idea of Christ, the underdog, to the same degree. I suppose partly, is that not because the Christ and Christianity is so closely identified with the autocracy in, let's say, Constantinople, and then I suppose in Moscow? The idea of there's no separation of church and state. So you wouldn't show the emperor as suffering.
Yes, perhaps, but I think it's more theological. It's more the weight that you put on Christ's human suffering, which in Latin Christendom becomes fundamental to religious practice and to theology. So Saint Anselm, who becomes Archbishop of Canterbury under William the Conqueror, he writes about seeing Christ on the cross and feeling this incredible agony and asking, why was I not there? Why did I not feel a sword stabbed through my heart as Christ's side was pierced by the spear? Why did I not feel the nails driven through my hands and feet? And this becomes something that expresses itself through artwork, through theology, through meditation, and that that becomes kind of very, very important to the specifically Latin and then Western practice of Christianity. But I think, ironically, one of the long-term consequences of that is that ultimately people in the West become desensitized to the horror of it, because in a sense the cross is so key to Christian practice that people start just to see it as a symbol without reflecting on the full horror of what it represents.
I think that's absolutely true. The cross is ubiquitous.
Yeah.
Because it's ubiquitous, we don't see it as an instrument. We don't see it as a kind of form, like, a much worse rack or something. It's not.
I mean, it's a horrible
thumbscrew. It's not. It's a torture. It's a torture instrument, but we don't see it as that anymore.
It's a horrible, horrible thing. And I, this episode, I mean, I think the subject is a fairly revolting and upsetting one. And I think to properly understand the impact that the idea of a crucified savior had in the early centuries of Christianity, you have to grasp that, you have to get that, you have to feel it. And ironically, of all the people who've written about Christianity and the figure of Christ over, say, the past 200 years, I think the thinker who most profoundly understood how kind of wrenching and weird the centrality of the cross is to Christianity was probably the West's most notorious atheist, Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw in the valorization of the victim on the cross something that he came to see as revolting, because it served to kind of sap, as he saw it, and destroy the strength and power that he identified classical civilization as embodying.
Yeah, he saw the cross as a symbol of servility and suffering and kind of wallowing in I mean, what would he say now if he had his own? I can imagine Nietzsche as this sort of incredibly intemperate, permanently cancelled podcaster talking about wallowing in victimhood. But that's what the cross does,
absolutely.
Right? I mean,
so it's a slave morality, he famously says.
Yeah.
That the valorization of slaves and victims. And he would absolutely, he would look at the Western world in 2022 and absolutely identify it as being completely Christian in its concern for, because
he would make Jordan Peterson look like the most wishy-washy.
Well, so if you think yourself back into a world that was capable of crucifying slaves and see that as a public good, that is to recognize that saying, assuming that the execution of slaves is somehow inherently, fundamentally, totally wrong is culturally illiterate, historically illiterate. It hasn't been seen as that for across vast swathes of the world, vast periods of time. And that is what Nietzsche kind of focuses on. So he and it's specifically this idea, the paradox he calls it, the formula, God on the cross, that hitherto, he writes, there had never and nowhere been such boldness in inversion, nor anything at once so dreadful, questioning and questionable as this formula. It promised a transvaluation of all ancient values. And he sees it as ushering in a sick, victim-obsessed world that he was revolted by. But I think that it's precisely the scale of Nietzsche's contempt for Christianity that draws attention to how Christian we in the West remain to this day. And we remain, the cross is fundamental to that, the idea of the crucifixion.
For people who find that argument interesting and have not maybe heard it before, so presumably have never listened to one of our podcasts before, Tom, is there any reading material you can recommend that they might enjoy on this subject?
There is. It is my own recently published book, Dominion, which is
it was mean of me to get you to do that. I should have done it myself. Tom's book, Dominion, is all about Christianity's impact on human history. So it's not a Christian book, as in Tom is a Christian who's trying to convert you. It's explaining how Christianity has seeped into all kinds of things without us even noticing it, and what a revolution that was. So one last point, Tom. This is an absolutely fascinating subject. When and why did crucifixion die out? Was it sort of tainted once the Roman Empire became Christian? Was it impossible to keep crucifying people because it was obviously reminiscent of Jesus's fate?
Yeah, so it gets banned by Constantine, who's converted to Christianity. He says, "Yeah, we're not going to have that." But it never fades completely from the Near East. So the Persian emperors continue to do it. And it is mandated in the Quran as a punishment for those who are rebels against God and his prophet. And so with the establishment of the caliphate, crucifixion returns as a punishment to the lands of the caliphate. And that's why the Islamic State, for instance, the past decade, when they established their, inverted commas, caliphate, they reintroduced crucifixion as a Quranically mandated punishment. So it's not completely gone.
That's terrifying, isn't it? When you think that it's a punishment deliberately designed to cause as much suffering as possible and to humiliate and so on. We have maybe travelled less far than we thought.
I know I've talked about this, and it makes me out to be incredibly brave. It's not what I'm talking about. It's not what
The great thing is it shows you not just, as I said to you when you threatened before the podcast that you would bring this up, I said it's brilliant because it doesn't just make you look very brave, it makes you look very kind and compassionate. So you win.
Dominic. Yes, it does. I win every way.
Stark contrast with the cynicism and callousness in Chipping Norton.
I know Nietzsche would spin in his grave this. I mention it simply because this was a documentary I made about what Islamic State did to Christians and to Yazidis, a religious minority in northern Iraq. And I went out there assuming that I wasn't going to have to go anywhere near the Islamic State. And due to a complicated concurrence of factors, I ended up in a taxi going to the front with the Islamic State to a town called Sinjar, where the Yazidis had lived, that had just been taken back by the Kurds. And because I was out there making this documentary, I had no choice but to go. So it wasn't my courage that took me there. In fact, the brave thing would have been to say, I'm too scared, I'm not going. I just kind of got swept along.
It was your cowardice in the face of the production coordinator.
Yes, we've all been there. So we ended up in this town where there are stories that Yazidi men were crucified there, and we were a mile or so away from the Islamic State, the people who'd done this. And I felt this kind of existential terror because suddenly I was within kind of mortar range of people for whom the cross did not serve as a symbol of what it served for me, of the triumph of the weak over the strong, but of the opposite, of the right of the strong to torture to death the weak. And it took me back to a Roman world. It took me back to a world in which Roman imperial authorities kind of exercised that sense of authority and power. And so I was writing Dominion at the time when I made that film. I came back and I rewrote the opening to focus on the crucifixion and what crucifixion had meant to the Romans and the revolution in understanding that the history of Christianity embodies. Because to reiterate, I do think it is profoundly, profoundly influential on the whole course of Western civilization and how we are influenced by it to this day.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you, Tom. You've persuaded me. And I imagine you're persuaded. I'm glad you weren't crucified.
Thanks. That's the sweetest thing you've ever said.
Yeah, otherwise I'd be doing this podcast with... well, who knows? Who knows?
Who knows?
Yeah, right in. No, that was absolutely fascinating. And I think it's we never do dwell on the horrible suffering that the crucifixion involved. And next year we can do the same with Easter eggs. Which
the other horror of Easter.
Right. So on that bombshell, thank you very much for listening. I hope you get the Easter Bunny brings you all you desire. And we will see you after Easter with some more historical delights. Goodbye.
Happy Easter. Goodbye. Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.